Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the warmth of Florida. But I must confess, I feel quite at home in this temperature. Thank you for coming tonight. Your presence confirms what I've experienced all around the world in the last few years, in that the question, do science and God mix, is a central question of our age. And I'm going to be very provocative tonight. I'm going to suggest that science and God mix perfectly, but science and atheism do not mix at all. So be warned. That is my basic thesis. The fact that science and God mix ought to be obvious. And it ought to be equally obvious that science and God cannot be in essential conflict. If you take, let's say, the Nobel Prize for Physics, it was won a couple of years ago by a Scotsman, Peter Higgs. He is an atheist. A few years before that, it was won by an American, Bill Phillips, who's a Christian. Now, it's perfectly obvious that their physics does not divide them. They've each won the same Nobel Prize. What does divide them is their worldview. And what I'm going to suggest to you, that if ever we're going to understand this question, there is a real conflict, but it's not between science and God. It's between two worldviews, the worldview of atheism and the worldview of theism in particular. That's a very ancient conflict. I love the ancient Greeks. And thinking back to the time of Leucippus and Democritus, the great fathers of the atomic theory, brilliant men they were. They had the idea that ultimate reality consisted of two things: the atoms, which could not be cut, atomos, and empty space. And as the atoms cascaded through empty space, they would form galaxies and worlds and so on, and life. They were the original materialists. And that demanded, of course, subsequently, in the nature of scientific explanation, that ultimate explanation was bottom-up, from the simple to the complex. And we have that today, of course. But at the same time, there were equally brilliant people like my intellectual hero Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who said, yes, the universe is real, but there's something more. There's transcendence. There are the gods, or there is God. And so barreling up through history into the 21st century, we've got these two worldviews which are diametrically opposed to one another. And they find representatives in most of the Western academies. But the point is that there are scientists on both sides of the divide. It's not a simplistic notion that it is impossible to be a scientist and believe in God. So the key question, I suppose, is this: in what direction does science point? Does it point towards atheism? Does it point towards theism? Or does it not point anywhere at all? Is it completely neutral? How would you decide a question like that? Well, the only way I know how to decide questions of any kind is to ask, what is the evidence? Now, I'm a pure mathematician, which many people find a very boring subject, but there it is. I love pure mathematics. But what's very important about pure mathematics is to realize it is the only intellectual discipline which has the rigorous concept of proof. A proof that begins with axioms, follows a prescribed course of logic, and ends up with conclusions. You get that in no other scientific discipline, and you don't get it in ordinary life either. The problem is we use the word proof in two different senses. There's the rigorous mathematical sense, which is unique to pure maths, and then there's the ordinary sense, Proof beyond reasonable doubt. What's your evidence? What are the pointers? And it's at that level I'm going to speak tonight. Now, don't run away with the idea that that kind of proof is weak. I've been married for 46 years to the same woman. I can't prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd risk my life on it because there's been 46 years of evidence. So that's the kind of thing I mean. And we're going to explore several sources for evidence to stimulate you to think. Now, it's wonderful to be in a university because a university is precisely that, where people of diverse conceptualizations of the universe can come together and they can share their worldviews and discuss the evidence for the one and for the other. And what I hope to do tonight is to give you an opportunity of hearing from a particular Christian perspective. I'm sure you've had people like Richard Dawkins here giving it to you from the opposite perspective so that you can be informed and, what is crucially important, make up your own mind. So we're in the stimulus business of ideas, and I can simply share the things that have been influential in my making the decisions I have made throughout my life. So where are we going to get the evidence from? First source is going to be history. I'm a scientist, but I've been very lucky to have had a personal mentor for about 60 years, the same person, who's a brilliant classicist, an ancient expert on ancient languages and culture. And he has taught me the value of history. So let's think of where modern science, and I mean modern science, came from. It exploded into being in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now here's the interesting thing. People who've studied that have asked, why did it happen then and there? And more or less, there is a general consensus that Alfred North Whitehead was right when he said it had centrally to do with the rationality of God and the Christian faith that was then widespread in Europe. C.S. Lewis put it even better. I'm old enough to have listened to C.S. Lewis, by the way, in Cambridge, so I'm a bit biased here. So I quote my fellow Irishman. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. Now here's the fascinating thing. Far from belief in God hindering science, it was arguably the motor that drove it in the first place. And I sometimes put that rather sharply by saying to people, I'm not remotely ashamed of being a Christian and a scientist. It was Christianity gave me my subject. Why should I be embarrassed? And Richard Dawkins, when I put that to him, wasn't very impressed, actually, I must be honest. He said everybody believed in God in those days, so of course science came from believers. But everybody, he'd forgotten China, which is a rather significant part of the world's population. And Joseph Needham, one of the world's experts on chemistry, the history of science in China and the Chinese language, who wrote the definitive history of technology and science in China, he, for years, because he was a neo-Marxist, tried to fit the lack of development of abstract science in China into a neo-Marxist paradigm. Now, listen to me carefully. The Chinese were brilliant at developing technologies, printing, explosives, and a lot of things. But we're talking about abstract science. And in the end, he discovered that his Marxist atheist paradigm was not adequate to explain the difference between the East and the West. And he said, he wrote quite a bit about this, he said, I will put the difference down to the fact that the Chinese didn't have the unifying concept of a single creator who created the universe to operate on fixed laws. So there you have it from the opposite direction. That, to my mind, is very significant, and it raises stunningly interesting questions. Because here are people like Galileo, Kepler, and Isaac Newton, the very brilliant founders of modern science, all believing in God. And the most famous person in the world today who has held Isaac Newton's chair, Stephen Hawking, doesn't believe in God. And so that raises a very interesting question. How have we got from Newton to Hawking? What has happened? And I want to suggest several things to you that have happened. And I think a lot of it has to do with confusion. I call it an intellectual fog. And I want to investigate some of that fog. Now, let's deal with the trivial first, the sort of Freudian explanation that God is a wish fulfillment, a projection of your ideas. Now, I mention that because Richard Dawkins advances it in the name of science. His book is called The God Delusion. But when I read it, I decided I'm not a psychiatrist and neither is Dawkins, so it might be good to consult a psychiatrist on the topic. And I discovered a very different story from Dawkins' idea. In fact, I discovered that the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Britain had written a book called Faith Isn't a Delusion, or sorry, Is Faith Delusional? And had come down to the conclusion that it absolutely isn't, and that the positive benefits of religious belief were the best kept secret of psychiatry today. And if the evidence gleaned from a series of meta-studies, not simply epidemiological studies, but meta-studies, had gone the other direction and suggested that faith in God was connected with aberration and delusion, it would have hit the press in the front page in every newspaper in the world. But because it went the other way, nobody knows about it, certainly not Dawkins. And you see, the Freudian argument works brilliantly, as Manfred Lutz, one of Germany's leading psychiatrists, with whom I'm doing a conference next week actually, he says if there is no God, then Freud explains brilliantly why religion is a wish fulfillment, a projection of your ideas of a father figure in the sky and so on, if there is no God. But of course, he goes on to say if there is a God, Freud will explain perfectly brilliantly why atheism is a delusion. The projection of the desire never to have to meet God and never to have to be responsible for all the things we've done wrong. It works both ways, and that's frequently forgotten. And then he says, well, whether there's a God or not, which is a substantive question, neither Freud, Frankl, or Jung can help you. I think he's dead right. A lovely, fun illustration, if you don't mind a personal reference, was when Stephen Hawking was asked by, I think, the Times in London not long ago, what he thought of religion. Oh, he said, it's a fairy story for people who are afraid of the dark. So I was asked what I thought of that, and I said, well, do you want a one-liner? They said, we do, we really do. Well, I said, okay, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. It's very kind of you to laugh, but if you've been following me, my argument, neither of those statements proves anything. But I leave it with you. That's the trivial side of things. We need to get below that. I think the first big confusion is not to do with science at all, but it's to do with the nature of God. See, when I was young last century, a long time ago, and if I gave a lecture on God, people usually understood what I was talking about. I was talking about the triune God of the Bible who created and sustains the universe in being, a personal God of infinite power, a God of love, and so on. But now, you see, that is not true, as I've discovered in many debates. I had a debate with the leading American skeptic, Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society, and looking at me, he used Dawkins' argument and said, you're an atheist, he said to me publicly in our Oxford debate, where we're all dressed in tuxedos, the God debate that we have every couple of years. He said, you're an atheist with respect to Zeus, and respect to Baal, and respect to Artemis, and respect to Ra, and respect to... And it went on rather boringly. And then he delivered the Trump line. He said, we just go one God more, and we're atheists with respect to Jehovah. And I thought, how childish. Doesn't he know anything about the ancient Near Eastern gods? Because they're something I have studied. And if you read serious people like Werner Jaeger about the ancient gods of the ancient Near East, you'll discover something very important, and it's this. The ancients, in their mythologies, had not only cosmogonies, but theogonies, the genesis of the gods. And in every case in the ancient world, the gods were generated by the primeval stuff of the universe. They were material gods. And Werner Jaeger points out the huge difference between the God of the the God of the Bible is not descended from the heavens and the earth. He created the heavens and the earth. So there's a vast difference. But there's something more, that suddenly it was an aha moment as I suddenly saw why it is that Stephen Hawking tells young people they've got to choose between science and God. I had never quite focused that. I thought it had to do with science. But I suddenly realized it has to do with his concept of God. Let me try and get this across to you in a simple way. If you take the Greek god of lightning, for example, well, Lecture 1 in atmospheric physics at the University of Florida will make the Greek god of lightning disappear forever. Because you'll understand how lightning works. You'll understand about atmospheric pressure, about electrical discharges, static electricity, and all the rest of it. Those gods were gods of the gaps. They were really, I can't explain it, therefore a god did it. Now, I suddenly woke up to the idea that Dawkins and co. think that that's the kind of God I believe in. So I come across something in science, I can't explain it, and I say, God did it. So, of course, you can see what's going to happen. The more science you do, the less space there is for God until he disappears like the grin on the proverbial Cheshire cat. Yeah? Now, this is crucially important. If you believe in a God like that, you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. Do you see that? If you define God to be the X factor, the explanation when science fails, then of course you've got to choose between science and God, because that's your definition of God, but it's not a biblical one. Because the Bible doesn't begin with the words, in the beginning God created the bits of the universe we don't understand. It starts in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the whole show. And that is vastly important, because that gets rid of that objection entirely. But I want to show you how it does by coming to another level. And that is the level of scientific explanation. Science explains. But what do we mean by saying science explains? See, I went to school, I learned the law of gravity. I later learned how to derive Kepler's equations and all the rest of it, and Newton's laws of motion and everything else, using them to derive the orbits of the planets, which was my little introduction to astronomy. And I began to love it. And nobody told me at school that the law of gravity didn't tell us what gravity was. Nobody knows what gravity is. It was only in later life I came across Wittgenstein's famous statement, where he says the greatest delusion of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They're not. They're descriptions with enormous predictive power in many cases and brilliantly helpful, but they don't tell you what gravity is. So that even at the level of explanation, when you've got a law of gravity, you haven't got everything, because you don't know what gravity is, which makes me much more astonished when I read in Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, that it's because of the law of gravity he doesn't believe in God. What he says is this: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, oh, I've got a law, I've got the explanation, I don't need God. What Newton did, just contrast this with Stephen Hawking, what Newton did was write the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica. And he expressed in it explicitly the hope that it would persuade a thinking person to believe in God. You see, Newton, when he discovered his law of gravity, said, isn't this genius? Now I understand a bit more the way the Creator did it. This makes me admire his genius more, not less. That's the way life works, of course. I was in your lovely Museum of Art this morning, looking at Monet. Beautiful stuff. Now, I'm not an expert in art. I can just dimly perceive that some of it's good. But if you studied art, you'd say, now, just look at the way he uses those flecks of colour. Just look at the way Rembrandt gets the light focusing on the night watchman in his famous painting. And as you begin, because you know the stuff, I begin to sense much more of the genius. The more you understand about art, the more you admire the genius of the person that did it that way. The more you understand engineering, the more you admire the genius of a Rolls Royce, a Rolls or a Royce, not the less. And that was Newton's attitude. Why? Because he didn't make the foolish mistake, and I call it foolish deliberately, I know of no other word to call it, of confusing different levels of explanation. Let me explain that to you very simply. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, because energy coming from a Bunsen flame is being transmitted through the copper of the kettle. We're in Ireland, of course, and the molecules of water are getting agitated by the heat, and they're moving faster and faster and faster, and that's why it's boiling. Suppose I said to you, nonsense, it's boiling because I need a cup of tea. Well, you laugh rightly. Those explanations don't contradict each other, nor do they conflict, do they? They complement. And what astonishes me is the failure of so many scientific friends of mine who are brilliant, and they're real friends of mine. They cannot see the difference. You see, the God explanation, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't compete or conflict with a scientific explanation because it's a different kind of explanation. It would be like saying that Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for a motor car engine. That's absurd. And kids in school can see that. Henry Ford is an explanation of a motor car engine in terms of human potentiality, designing capacity. It's an agent explanation. The law of internal combustion, and if you like, automobile engineering, is a scientific explanation. They run in parallel. We're totally used to it. Why is it when we come to the universe we insist it's either or? It's not either or. So God is not competing with science. God isn't getting smaller as science grows. In Newton's view, in my view, God is perceived to be greater as science grows. Because the more we understand of the universe, the more we can admire his genius. Now, one of the problems today, of course, is, and I must just mention this en passant, is the notion that science is the only way to truth. Well, that is hubris, and it's absurd, because if it were true, you'd have to close half the faculties in this distinguished university. There'd be no linguistics, there'd be no history, there'd be no economics, it'd all be science. And anyway, it's rather lovely. I love logic, by the way. I got the infection, I think, from C.S. Lewis and other people, and Kurt Gödel. But I love logic. And to make the statement, science is the only way to truth, is that a scientific statement? No. It's a statement about science. So if it's true, it's false. It's too late at night for logic like that, so I better move on. It is absurd to suggest, and Sir Peter Medawar, who oddly enough is one of my heroes and also one of Dawkins' heroes, he said it's so easy to see that science is limited. It can't answer even the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? Science is not coextensive with rationality, ladies and gentlemen. But that is an impression that many of the highly vocal voices that belong to the so-called new atheists are trying to get across to young people. That's an absurd idea. Einstein said, you know, you can speak about the ethical foundations of science, but you can't speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. Science has its limits. And that does it no disservice. It puts it in its correct place. And I'm passionate about science, but I think it does everybody a great disservice to put it in too high a position. Now, that's a subject in its own right, so we must move on. So, what have we talked about so far? We've talked about evidence, but now I want to talk about another intellectual fog, and it surrounds the concept of faith. What is faith? I'm very often asked to deliver lectures entitled Science and Faith. I never give them. At least I say to the people asking me, do you wish me to talk about God? They say, of course, that's why the word faith is there. Oh, I say, really? What do you think faith means? Because I can give you a lecture on science and faith without mentioning God at all, because faith is essential to science. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, that faith has been redefined in the last 20 years. Faith comes from the Latin fides in English, and it's trust, and it conveys ideas of commitment, and we use it in everyday life. Have you got faith in the markets, for instance? That's another story. And it's an interesting story because the markets crashed because we had too much faith in the bankers and it wasn't evidence-based. And the whole thing froze until faith could be regenerated. Everybody in the Western world understands what evidence-based faith is. And yet, some of my dear friends meet me and they say, you're a man of faith. And that's an insult. Because what they mean by it is, you believe where there's no evidence. Because faith has now become, for millions of people in the West, a religious concept, which means believing where there's no evidence. That is doubly false and very dangerous. Faith is an ordinary word. It means trust and so on. And of any commitment of faith, I believe the Gators are going to win the ball season. Perhaps you say things like that here, do you? I have faith in the Gators. Well, on what basis, please? That's the next logical question. I'm sure you're all committed believers here. But you see, you're all laughing because you can see that this is a natural use of the concept. We need to get totally away from this nonsense that faith is only to do with the religion. Nonsense, I feel that's, well, Christopher Hitchens says that our beliefs are not a belief. Our faith is not a faith. He couldn't solve the problem. And Dawkins says, atheists have no faith. And then he writes a 400-page book about what he believes. I mean, it is absolutely stunningly astonishing what the semantics have got us into. Now, faith, in my understanding of it as a Christian and as a scientist, is a response proportioned to evidence. On the Christian side, just briefly, at the end of the fourth biography of Jesus, John's Gospel, he explains what faith is. John says, Jesus did many other signs, miracles, which are not written in this book, but these are written in order that you might believe. Here's the evidence on which faith can be based. The Christian faith is evidence-based. Other faith traditions must speak for themselves. But now comes the crucial thing. Redefining faith as a religious term that means believing without evidence obscures the fact that science and faith are intimately involved. Einstein saw it very, very clearly indeed. He said, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. Now, he didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum mechanics. Anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the temple of science are written the words, ye must have faith. It is a quality the scientist cannot dispense with. And it's obvious why that is true. I was taught physics long ago and quantum mechanics at Cambridge by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne. And in his books, he reminds us, he said, you know, to start physics, you've got to believe the universe is, at least in part, accessible by the human mind. And he says this means that physics is powerless to explain its own faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe, because you have to assume the rational intelligibility of the universe in order to do any physics at all. That is, science is squarely based on the faith commitment that science can be done, to put it simply. I believe, as I sit here, and I believe my colleague here does too, that science can be done and is worth doing. That's our commitment. So this idea that faith is a religious word, has nothing to do with science, and means believing where there's no evidence, is very dangerous, indeed. We need to get back to this central thing, but now it raises a series of fascinating questions. Because I ask the question that I asked about the Gators: what's the grounds of your faith? So sometimes I have fun. Let me bring it down to story time. Oxford Common Room, and my colleagues, and the conversation's a bit boring. So I say to some of them, tell me, what do you do science with? Oh, they say, I've been given $1 million. I've got this fantastic. I said, I don't mean that. I mean this. Oh, they say, you mean and they're almost about mind, when they remember there's no such thing as mind. And so they say their brain. I believe there is a mind, but that's another story. Okay, I say, I accept that for the moment. You do science with your brain, do you? How very interesting. Tell me about the brain. What could you tell me about the brain? They say, do you want the long story? No, I want a synopsis. What's your simplest take on the brain? Well, my simplest take on the brain is it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And you trust it. Some of you will be surprised to hear who was the first to raise that problem. Charles Darwin. Let me read to you what he wrote. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, what Darwin is raising there is a profoundly interesting question that goes back to Socrates at least, who was very skeptical about reductionist explanations of human thought. C.S. Lewis in the 1940s raised it, but not many people took any notice of him. He said science has been very successful because we've been thinking about the world, but what we've forgotten to do is think about thinking. And any theory that invalidates thinking must be ruled out of court because it destroys not only belief in God, but all of science and rationality with it. Now, I want to suggest to you, and this is the meaning of my sort of subtitle, atheism and science don't sit well together, because I want to contend that it's the heart of the current debate, that if you follow atheism to its logical conclusion, you destroy any base for faith in the power of human rationality to cope with the universe. You destroy truth, you destroy objectivity, you destroy science, you destroy reason. And I'm not prepared to go down that route because it's a logical contradiction in itself. Now, the people that are working on this are some surprising people. Alvin Plantinga is one of the world's most distinguished philosophers. He's a Christian. If Dawkins is right, he says that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including his science and his atheism. Now listen to this. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. You say, but that's a Christian. Okay, the logic doesn't depend on what you believe, but let me go to an atheist. A world-famous philosopher, Thomas Nagel, in New York, who doesn't want there to be a God. He's very explicit about what he believes. And in a book called Mind and Cosmos, which has, incidentally, the most explosive subtitle I've ever read anywhere, the subtitle of his book is Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. Now, this is a leading atheist philosopher of science. Here's what he writes. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. That's stunningly interesting to me. This is an atheist speaking. saying there's something wrong with this reductionist type of explanation of the universe. And there is. And I want to close by saying something about reductionism. And I probably have to tell you another story to illustrate it. Most of us have been brought up in the sciences to think that explanation always goes from the simple to the complex. And it often does, stunningly successfully. In fact, so successfully that many people equate science with the reductionist approach. It's bottom up. Things are explained in terms of something below them. Now, there are all kinds of questions about that, but I want to go to the heart of it. And I think that although it's been very successful, there's one area in which it totally fails. And we all can understand that. So let me tell you my story. Forgive me if you've heard it before by peeping on the internet when you shouldn't and watching one of my lectures. But it illustrates the point, and it's very important. My college at Oxford, we have these lovely candlelit dinners every Thursday night. And the only drawback is you can't choose where you sit. So I found myself one night talking to a very eminent biochemist. And he asked me what I did, and I said, well, I'm a pure mathematician. And without hesitation, he said, how dreadfully boring. And I was a bit taken aback because I could sense the sting in it, you see. So I said, well, I know it's socially a bit unacceptable for some people, but I try to make up for that by being interested in the big issues of life. He said, like what? Well, I said, the status of the universe, for instance. Is it created or not? The status of your... Oh, he said, stop. He said, it's worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about, and we're going to have a miserable evening. Well, that was a challenge. So I said, I think we're going to have a fascinating evening. He said, why? Well, I said, take reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. What kind are you? I said, I said in my science, I'm a methodological reductionist. Take a big problem, split it into little problems, do research into little problems, and try and solve the big problem. He said, I do that. I said, we agree on something. But he said, that's not what I am. I said, no, you're an ontological reductionist. You believe that everything in the end can be reduced, ontos, being. All of being can be reduced to physics and chemistry. And he said, that's right. So he said, why don't we do an experiment? He said, what? The dinner table. I said, sure, this is Oxford. So he said, what's the experiment? So I picked up the menu and got him to read it. It said roast chicken, rather unimaginatively. I said, what's the problem with it? I said, there's no problem from my perspective, but have a look at those marks on the paper. R-O-A-S-T. Yes, he said, it's roast. I said, how do you know? I said, they're just marks on paper, aren't they? No, but he said, they mean roast. Oh, I see. They carry a semiotic dimension, do they? Okay, I said, now here's my question to you. You explain to me how those marks carry meaning using only the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. His wife was sitting beside him, and rather unkindly she said to him, and rather loudly, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. His answer was stunning in its intellectual honesty. He said, John, for 40 years, I've gone into my lab in Oxford thinking that could be done. I was completely gobsmacked. And I backtracked, played devil's advocate, and say, look, physics and chemistry have only been going 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. The nature of the problem shows you that an intelligence has got to be involved. Simple, isn't it? And he looked at me for a long time, and I could see the wheels going. You're not bright enough to think of that argument. So he said it in the end. Where did you get the argument? I said, I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. Oh, he said, that's a relief. But then I said, an intelligence of the gaps. Is it? The level of physics and chemistry, I can't explain it, therefore God did it, and intelligence did it. Oh, no. Because the moment we see language anywhere of any kind Whatever natural processes are involved in putting before us the material, we infer that a mind's been involved somewhere. Now here's where the fun starts. He was a biochemist. In his lab, he studied DNA. The longest word we've ever discovered, 3.5 billion chemical letters long, all in the right order. He looks at that, and I ask, what's the origin of that? Oh, chance and necessity. What? Chance and the laws of nature, yes. And yet ROAST tells you immediately that it's not chance and necessity. Something very odd is going on, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever the natural processes, treat DNA. I saw your lovely DNA bridge on the way in here. Treat DNA as a black box. But it's a word. The longest word we've ever discovered. And words are connected in all our experience, without exception, with intelligence. How is it? That's my question to my friends. That you see the word ROAST, you immediately imply intelligence, and you see DNA, and you've got to reduce it. Why? Well, of course, because it raises the God question instantly. We started with two worldviews. We'll close by thinking of them again. The atheist worldview essentially says in the beginning was mass energy, the multiverse, particles, whatever. And bottom up, they built the universe using the laws of nature, but please don't ask where they came from. And they created the mind and the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview, the one I hold, ladies and gentlemen, goes like this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. All things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. That's the exact opposite. And you see, here's the fascinating thing. We live in the information age. And some physicists, like John Wheeler, and others suggest that information, well, information's interesting, isn't it? It's hard to define. But it's not material. The irony of the 21st century is one of the most important concepts in science is not material. Information. So I'm left with this. Which worldview makes more sense? The world that starts with the particles and claims that they generated mind and word, or the exact opposite? The worldview that starts with word and tells me that mass and energy are derivative. I know what I've chosen, and you might guess what it is. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So Professor Lennox has agreed to address a few questions. Some of these have been submitted prior to the meeting. I believe there is a hashtag, UF Veritas, if you have a question you'd like to submit. I'm told that there is a group in the back that is viewing the Twitter account, and if they see in a question that looks articulate and different from what's on my sheet, they will send it to my old-fashioned BlackBerry, which they claim will show up, and I've already gotten one, so it looks like it's working very well. Professor Lennox, may I call you John?
Oh, please do.
Very good, and we very much enjoyed your talk. I have some questions that were submitted by various people, and I'll walk through these, and we'll see how many we get through. But I'm not going to let you get out easily with the answers.
I wouldn't expect you
Very
to.
excellent.
This man's a professor of material science.
I will tell you that when you treaded on the gator part, you were in dangerous territory.
Yes, well, my wife feels that, walking near alligators is a very dangerous thing. We love Florida, both of us. And once she got out, she said, you mustn't go too near to those things. And she got out thinking the whole world was clear. and suddenly one leapt about 6 feet in the air, 2 feet behind her. And she's had nightmares ever since. But that's got nothing to do with our topic.
All right, very good. All right, the first question starts with a statement. And the statement is the following. If there is a God, he, she, or it must be independent of human existence. Do you agree with that statement? And if so, why?
Is a reason given?
Is there a reason given for the statement?
In the question? No.
No.
Well, I don't agree with the statement that God is not interested in human beings. But I can understand why some people make it, because of the very complex picture that our world presents to us. I actually gave a lecture on this topic last night in this university about the fact that as we look around, we see beauty in barbed wire. And most of my friends who have become atheists for this particular reason. They say, look, God can't be interested in us because look at what he allows. Now, I'm going to be very naughty because I gave a whole lecture on this and had questions on it last night, and it's going to be on the internet. And we'll spend the whole evening answering that if we try to answer it again tonight. So that's all I will say. I do think that Christianity has a very deep answer to that problem. And my very shortcut answer would perhaps surprise some of you. It's that God so loved the world that he gave his son. That there's something about Christianity that brings God very near. But we're stepping way outside God and science. You won't get it from studying science.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that. So what we know about our existence here in the universe is that we are a minuscule part of a vast universe.
Mm-hmm.
We also know that in the timeline that the universe has existed, human recorded history is a minuscule amount of time. So in this vast universe, vast amount of time, we have this insignificant grouping called people that you would claim, that Christianity claims, that there's a God that cares about those people. Does that speak more towards that group of people are so special? Or does that speak towards how large and how big this God of Christianity that you profess must be?
Well, the universe is large and it's ancient. But you know I'm a mathematician. And if you work on a logarithmic scale, a human being at 6 feet tall is about halfway between an elementary particle the size of the observable universe. So we're right in the middle. It depends on what scale of thinking you're working on. Point number 2, we may be small, but you know it's interesting. Tonight as I came in, there was a wonderful view. Please look at it when you go out, because Venus is right sitting beside the moon, and it looks utterly spectacular. And I couldn't help thinking as I looked up there, I know the moon and Venus are there. They don't know I'm here. You see, size is not a measure of importance. Ask any woman whether she'd rather have a lump of coal or a diamond. Think about that. So, it seems to me, therefore, that we can invert this picture possibly. Seriously, from a scientific perspective. Let me give one example of that. That human beings are so special, and that this is where I sit, they are special. They are made in the image of God, whereas the universe shows its glory. It's not made in his image. You and I are. Now, we're made of carbon. How do you get carbon? Well, from several generations of stars. It may be, and I'm putting that as it may be, but the astronomers do argue this, that you need these long ages and so on to get the conditions that are right for having beings like us. So if you turn the story upside down, as I believe it can be arguably done within the scientific framework, you get a very different perspective on that.
Very good. So we just talked about the universe and a God creating man. If God created man, Who created God?
So excuse me laughing, ladies and gentlemen, because I was staggered to find that argument central to Richard Dawkins' book. Utterly staggered. Well, he had two versions of it, actually. The one was, if you believe a creator created the universe, then you've got to logically ask who created the creator. And the other one, which is more sophisticated and actually far more interesting, is that God doesn't explain anything because he's more complex than the thing you're explaining, so he's not an explanation. Now, I've actually answered the second question. But I'll go to the first question. Who created God? Now, a little bit of a logical analysis. This is what philosophers call a complex question. It doesn't sound very complex. But think about it. Who or what created X? Let me abstract one level from it so that we get God out of it. Just the question. Who or what created X? What does the question assume? It assumes that X is created. So it doesn't apply to an uncreated X by definition. So the question, who created God, assumes that God is created. So it obviously doesn't apply to the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is eternal. In the beginning, the Word already was. God was, is, and ever shall be. So the question sounds very clever, but it actually bypasses the substantive point completely. Let me put it another way. If Richard Dawkins' book had been called not the God delusion, but the created God's delusion, nobody would have been interested in it, because we don't need him to tell us that created gods are a delusion. We normally call them idols. So the question actually doesn't relate at all to the substantive question, is there an eternal God? So my next question then is, does Richard believe in anything eternal? But the problem is I've never really managed to get that out of him. So the difficulty is clearly there. It's not to do with the question itself, but there's a sting in it. You see, well, I put it to him. That question is valid for created things. Okay, I said, let me try it on you then, Richard Dawkins. I said, you believe the universe created you. Well, let me ask you your own question. Who created your creator? I've been waiting 8 years to get an answer to that. So I really think, now let me take it more seriously philosophically, David, because what it's really doing is asking a question, is there such a thing as an ultimate eternal reality? And you see, whatever track you go on, the atheist or, like me, a Christian theist, you come to a full stop. The questions don't go back forever. Both sides end with essentially a brute fact. My atheist friends end with a universe, a multiverse, mass energy, or nothing. I go back to God. And it's one of the ironies of the 20th century scientific debate is that the big contrast now, the two poles in the whole debate are God and nothing. But that's another story. And I'm not going to say a word about it unless I'm asked.
So some people refer to science that incorporates faith in God. It's a term you didn't like there, but we'll use it anyway, as pseudoscience. The questioner asks, isn't it better to trust reason rather than a holy book?
A holy book, yes. Well, I can see where that comes from, you see. Is science that incorporates faith in God pseudoscience? Well, suppose I were to restate that and say, is automobile engineering that incorporates belief in Henry Ford pseudo-automobile engineering? Well, now you've got to be careful with the answer here, because, well, first of all, the Bible is not a scientific textbook. I don't teach algebra from Leviticus, and never have done. On the other hand, the Bible does say some very important things about the physical universe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is talking about the same universe that the scientists talk about. So there's your holy book. Now, what I say is that science incorporating faith in God is a formulation I would never use. Does my science incorporate a belief in God? Well, I believe that the very fact I can do science is evidence of God's existence. So at that meta level, it does. But if I'm spelling out the science itself and teaching applied mathematics, I'm not going to mention God. Just as if you're explaining how a motor car engine works, you may not have to mention Henry Ford at all. So it's the word incorporate. What I would rather say is, can my faith in God exist comfortably with my faith in science? Of course it can. The one fuels the other. It's atheism that has the problem, not Christian faith in God. So the holy book thing needs something said about it, because this is a point that Dawkins makes in his book. We believe in reason, not in revelation. That's a false apposition. As you can see that very simply. You could put me under a scanning, tunneling microscope, the very last word in all these magnificent hospitals you've got. What a good city to live in, by the way, with all that medical facility. But you'd never get to know me as a person by putting me in a scanning, tunneling microscope. You'll only get to know me as a person if I reveal myself to you. In other words, if I talk to you. Now, tell me this. If I start talking to you, does that shut off your reason? Of course not. You use your reason to understand my words. I've never yet met a person that can read any book, let alone a holy book, without using their reason. That's sheer nonsense. It's a confusion of categories. So let me try and sort out that confusion, because it's relatively easy. As a Christian, I claim, well, it's very old, Roger Bacon, the father of modern science, the idea of God's two books, the book of nature and the book of God's word. You use your reason on both. Of course you do. That's the way it works. They're two sources of information, both accessible to a certain degree by human reason. And it's very important to realize that they don't conflict. Reason and revelation don't conflict with one another at all. And revelation at the human level is absolutely essential. When it comes to interpersonal relationships, you cannot get to know another person without revelation that is understood through reason. So I just think there's a very deep confusion there.
We have a question from someone who tweeted, who sent it to my BlackBerry, and it works.
Well, when I grew up, it words that tweeted.
No, this is technology. And it's actually an excellent question. It comes back to your concept of evidence. And the questioner asks, how rigorous and what sort of evidence should be compelling for someone with an incorrect belief to transition to a more correct one?
Well, David Hume, with whom I disagree on many things, particularly miracles, I think was right when he said that faith and belief should be proportionate to evidence. And if it's something trivial in everyday life, it doesn't matter either way, so you don't ask for much evidence. But changing your intellectual paradigm, that's another matter altogether. Now, precisely because the backstory to this is, and it's very important to me, this question, I have never known what it is like not to believe in God. I'll be honest with you. My parents were Christians, so were my grandparents, and so were their parents. But the wonderful thing about my parents is that they allowed me to think and encouraged me to read all kinds of faith traditions, all sorts of stuff, which is very unusual in Northern Ireland, which is a reputation for Christian narrowness, unfortunately, and sectarianism. My parents weren't sectarian either. So I get to Cambridge, and in the very first week, a student says to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then suddenly realizes who he's talking to and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have asked you that question. After all, you're Irish, and all you Irish believe in God and fight about it." Now, I'd heard that many times, but it was a trigger that set me on my life's quest. Is it just Irish genetics that make me a Christian? So what I did on that day in Cambridge, and I've done it ever since, was deliberately to search out people that didn't come from my background, had never been to church, didn't believe in God, or were agnostic and so on, and started a dialogue. And the thing that's helped me to answer that question is watching people over the years come from different worldviews and become Christians. Sometimes with a lot of persecution, actually. Huge step of change of paradigm. But the strict question is that big things demand a lot of evidence. And when it comes to Christianity specifically, as distinct from mere theism, of course you'll want huge evidence, because Jesus Christ claims to be God. And the fundamental Christian confession is that Jesus Christ is Lord. To acknowledge somebody else as your Lord is no mean thing. You want huge evidence for it, which is why I think that God has provided us with huge evidence. And what the early Christians preached, and what I do today, is to go to the heart of the thing, which is the death and resurrection of Christ on the world stage. But that's another subject in a way, but it's the way I approach this question. I need big evidence, of course I do, because my life search has been, am I being fooled? That's what led me to East Germany to study. I'll just explain this to you. To get in among people who have been systematically exposed to atheism. And as I speak their language, I was able, during the Cold War I was able to mix with them. And then when the wall fell, and I helped knock it down, but that's another story. I started going to Russia because I speak that language as well, getting to know people in the Academy of Sciences and really listening to them. What is their faith story? Why are they atheists? Why can they not? So it's a cumulative thing. There's no five-word answer to that question, David, I'm afraid. I'm not ducking it. It's the whole of life has been engaged. And in fact, that's why I've written my books, to try and explore this, to help people to see from their own perspective that I believe that I have some evidence to offer. And there's no other way of answering the question but sifting the evidence for yourself. But that's what universities are for.
So this talk was based upon a discussion of science and God, and incompatibility or not. And you just talked about evidence for changing one's beliefs. So within the context of science, what is the greatest scientific backing, in your opinion, that God actually does exist?
That he does exist.
That he does exist.
Oh, let's say off the top of my head, the greatest scientific evidence for the existence of God. Well, number one is the case I've been arguing. It's the very fact we can do science. You don't need to go to the results of science. It's much deeper than that. It's the fact that you can do science that indicates to me there's an intelligence behind the universe. And that fits in with the history perfectly. That's number one. But secondly, specific things. The rational intelligibility in terms of language now, which is taking that first argument a bit further, seems to me to fit beautifully with the notions, the biblical notions, that the universe was a series of speech acts. And God said, let there be light. And God said, and God said. That you've got, well, the basic thing, and of course it's a huge claim, is that this universe is not a closed system. It's an open system. And God spoke and he created the different levels. Information, energy coming from outside. In the beginning was the Word. Genesis unpacks that John. That all makes sense. Now, what's that got to do with God? Well, it's a biblical claim that it was God that was behind it. So, what I'm really saying is this. I'm really using what I learned from C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity very much as I believe in the sun, not because I see it, it's dangerous to look at it directly, but because in its light I see everything else. Now, from where I sit, coherence is one of, not the only, but coherence is one of the characteristics of truth. Does it cohere? Does it fit together? And secondly, correspondence. Does it correspond to my experience of reality? And therefore, what has happened in my life on the scientific side is I see that those few, and they are relatively few, indicators in Scripture that have to do with the physical universe are so apt and make so much sense. I remember having a discussion with one of the world's leading astronomers, and he was poo-pooing the Bible and all of this, and he said, goodness me, he said, you don't believe this stuff. He said, do you? Surely, please tell me you're not as naive as some of the Christians I've met. So he said, he challenged me to prove to him that it made sense. So I went up to his blackboard and I wrote the words, and God said, let there be light. And he started to laugh. I'll never forget it. He said, you are one of those people. He said, that's utterly naive. Do you believe God has a voice box and lungs like we've got? I said, no, you're being naive. This is very simple language. But said, let me write it another way. So underneath I wrote, in the beginning was the Word. He said, what does that mean? Well, I said, that word for word is logos, from which we get logic, information. And he stopped me. He said, what did you say? I said, you heard me. But he said, you're not seriously telling me that the Bible is a concept of information. I said, what does it look like? He said, does Sir Fred Hoyle know about this? I said, I don't know. Well, he said, we'd better tell him. And we did, but that's another story. But the point is the coherence of the biblical record. The next point I'd come to is the fine-tuning. The fine-tuning of the universe, which is not God of the gaps thinking, it's the exact opposite. In the last 50 years, we've come across the incredible precision with which the basic parameters and constants of nature have to be within such rigorous limits in order to have a universe on which carbon-based life is possible. Now, what interests me is not what I think of that, but what the physicists think about that. And it's very interesting to me. You get a non-theist like Paul Davies, who's a brilliant writer, who says the evidence of intelligence is overwhelming. So this idea that it's so fine-tuned that probabilities just disappear. And as Sir Fred Hoyle said, and he was the one who, bless him, he should have got the Nobel Prize for his prediction of the resonance of carbon. And when he discovered that to get carbon you had to have a certain very narrow window, but it was a big one. In our contemporary sense, it was 1 or 2%. He said, nothing shook my atheism like discovering that. I wonder what he'd said to Sir Roger Penrose, who now says, if you want a universe with a second law of dynamics. Now, Roger is not, he's a colleague of mine at Oxford, he's not a theist. He's a member of the British Humanist Society, but he says in his book, if you want a universe with a second law of thermodynamics, informally that means even your Cadillac will rust. If you want a universe like that, like ours, the Creator's aim has to be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, which is a number you couldn't even write out if you put a 1 here and a 0 in every elementary particle of the universe. So that I find interesting because it parallels again the biblical account of fine-tuning, which says that it was built stepwise and it had a goal, human beings. That's the biblical parallel of the scientific fine-tuning. So it makes sense. So I would say, without going on, that there are cumulative arguments. And one of them, and I was at a very leading physics installation, and I can't name it because it was a closed meeting, but I was invited to discuss in the aftermath of the discovery of the Higgs boson, because somebody, I think Lawrence Krauss of the Arizona State University, had put out that the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. Well, that really got me as an Irishman. I thought I got to write something about this. So I wrote an article which became a book, God and Stephen Hawking. And I said to Lawrence Krauss, I've debated with him, yes, the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God if you're teaching atomic physics. But if you're trying to answer the question why there is a universe in which nuclear physics can be done, God is arguably more important than the Higgs boson. It depends what kind of question that you're asking. But in this context, there was a breathtaking rush as one of the world's leading physicists suddenly stopped me and said, Professor Lennox, please tell us you're joking when you suggested that this ancient book, the Bible, has anything relevant to say to us physicists in the 21st century. There are 50 of the world's leading intellectuals sitting around the table. And I said, of course I wasn't joking. I said, isn't it interesting that for centuries, in fact thousands of years, the Bible has stated there was a beginning. But the intellectual tradition in Western Europe preferred to go with Aristotle, that the universe was eternal. Could I dare suggest to you, gentlemen, that if you had taken the Bible more seriously, you might have looked for evidence for a beginning before you did? You see, sometimes people say, don't they, that the Bible is useless. It's not a scientific textbook. It makes no predictions. Oh, yes, it does. Not very many, but they are very important. If you take the Bible seriously, you will know that science can be done. Because on page 2 of the Bible, God told them to get on with taxonomy, name the animals. That's the fundamental intellectual discipline right across the board. Isn't that interesting? You do it. I'm not going to do it for you. Secondly, if you read the first line of the Bible, you would know there was a beginning. Got it right. And I put it to Dawkins, and he said, don't be absurd. You know, there either was a beginning or there wasn't. You have a 50% chance of getting it right. I said, Richard, it wasn't decided by tossing a coin. It took enormous pressure from the scientific establishment on the basis of the Hubble expansion of the universe, the microwave background, and so on and so forth, to get the scientific establishment to take seriously the idea of a beginning to space-time. Do you know why? Well, none of you are old enough to remember what happened, but I do. The editor of Nature, the world's most prestigious scientific periodical, said, we must not allow ourselves to go down the road of believing in a beginning. Why? Because it will give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. The biggest advance in cosmology in the 20th century was held up and resisted because it resonated so closely with Genesis 1. I find that extremely interesting. Don't know whether it answers your question or not.
It's close. It's close. You've talked a bit about science that supports the concept that God exists and that He created the universe. Are there parts of science that are a challenge to the concept of God, and in particular, the concept of evolution?
No.
You'll have to say.
Oh, you want me to explain that? Oh, well.
Do you believe in evolution?
Evolution has at least 5 meanings. Which one do you mean? Let me answer that, because that would take very long. I've written another book about it, by the way, if you want to follow this. But evolution, in the sense of what Darwin noticed, is totally uncontroversial. That we live in a world where there's competition for food and so on, and it's clear that if you've got some sort of advantage, you will survive. Mutation, natural selection do something. Just look around this room. You don't look the same to me anyway. So selection has been going on. It goes on at universities these days as well. But that's another story. And there is mutation, so it does something. And that creates part of the confusion, that people don't separate the different meanings. So if people say, do you believe in evolution? I say, well, I've no quibble with what Charles Darwin observed. The differences, the cyclic differentiations and Finch Beak's length and all that kind of thing. You can observe that. So it's not controversial, as point number one. Point number two is that it gets more controversial as you go down. Mathematicians have a notable track record of skepticism, because those of them that know a bit about information theory enter the fray. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. But the question for me scientifically is, does the mechanism of natural selection and mutation, can it bear all the weight that's put on it? Now let me just excite your imagination by a quotation. By accident, I've got it here. How about this? This is one of the world's top molecular biologists, University of Chicago, in a book, Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. As many professional and popular press articles attest, the accidental, stochastic, that is, chance nature of mutations is still the prevailing and widely accepted wisdom on the subject. This insistence on randomness and accident is not surprising. It springs from a determination in the 19th and 20th centuries by biologists to reject the role of a supernatural agent. The DNA record definitely does not support the slow accumulation of random gradual changes transmitted by restricted patterns of vertical descent. Little evidence fits unequivocally with the theory that evolution occurs through the gradual accumulation of numerous successive slight modifications. Clear evidence exists for abrupt events. I'm not a biologist, but I read the stuff. I find that intriguing, because Richard Dawkins' book that held sway for years, The Blind Watchmaker, says that natural selection does everything. And it's gradual. It's climbing Mount Improbable in little steps, and this man simply denies it. Watch this space, because my impression, I don't take it from me because I'm not a biologist. I do go to biology seminars in Oxford, by the way, where the father of systems biology spends his whole time questioning the Darwinian mechanism. But that's another story. My impression is that at the very top, questions are being asked that haven't really been asked before, for the reason given here. Now, that's not an answer to the question, but it increases my scientific skepticism that the mechanism, if you call it a mechanism, of natural selection mutation, which can do something, that's very clear, cannot bear all the weight that's put on it. In particular, I would love to see evidence that it can generate novel information. Now, I want to say one more thing. A lot of the confusion in this debate has been caused by the failure to see that the origin of life and evolution have nothing to do with each other. Dawkins had finally admitted it. But in The Blind Watchmaker, he said the mechanism, the blind unconscious automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is responsible for the existence and variation of all life. It's not. It's not responsible for the existence of life for the most trivial of reasons. Evolution, whatever you think it is, depends on life existing before it can get started. You have to have a mutating replicator. So you can't use evolution to explain the existence of life. And America's leading science writer admitted to me in public last night in Stevens College up in New York. He said, you know, you Christians, you ought to be working not so much at evolution at the species level, but at the origin of life. And yes, we ought, because there are lots of things. Now, I've got chapter after chapter on this on my book, God's Undertaker, so you can have a look at that. Now, but let me sidestep the whole thing. I've got all sorts of questions that are mostly to do with science, not to do with my Christianity. But now let me wear my Christian hat for a moment, or my philosophical hat. Whatever you think of evolution, you can't deduce atheism from it. You see, nobody batted an eyelid when I said, Newton, we have a mechanism, we have a law, gravity. Newton didn't say we don't need God because we got a law or a mechanism. So, there are many people around who will argue with Francis Collins and others, for example, and they'll say, well, this is a mechanism that does something. Well, that's no argument against someone who created that mechanism. In fact, if it exists and there is a God, he did create it. That doesn't answer the question. It bypasses whether this particular mechanism is responsible for increases in information. That's a different thing. So what I say to your question is that that kind of thing has never made me begin to doubt the existence of God, because I see it's a philosophical category mistake to deduce atheism from a science. They're not even in the same category. One's a worldview, the other is an intellectual discipline analyzing the natural world. Now, I know that's totally inadequate, But then this is a Q&A. I just want to give little things to spark you off. If you disagree, that's great. Go and read.
So has there ever been a time when you've had to abandon something that you believe to be true scientifically because of your faith in...
Has there ever been a time when I felt I had to abandon something that I believed on the science side because of something the Bible said?
Correct.
No. I really can't think of anything. I can think of times when the Bible has informed me scientifically. And as we could expand this topic, of course, because ideas of what the Bible says about the universe have changed. Who they have changed. I like to imagine us having this lecture in the 14th century. Do you know what the big question would have been? It wouldn't have been about evolution. It would be, Professor Lennox, what do you think of this nonsense that the Earth moves? All of you would have believed it was fixed, whether you believed in God or not. You'd have said the Bible says it's fixed, and Aristotle says it's fixed. Well, boy, is it fixed. I've written a book on that as well, but that's another matter. I'm going to leave that one.
As you have understood science better, has there been opportunities where your concept of God and your interpretation of the Bible had to be modified because something from the science, something from your training, something from your mathematics has shown that your concept, maybe taught as a child, maybe taught at some point, just didn't jive, and that you had to come to grips with that was wrong, had to be modified?
That's harder to answer. You see, what's behind this is very interesting to me. And it's this: how do we interpret any literature? Some people say to me, you mustn't use science in interpreting the Bible. And behind that again stands, very often I get this question, so I might as well throw it in because I know some of you are thinking it. Don't you take the Bible literally? And I say nobody does. Jesus said, I am the door. Do you take that literally? You don't, do you? How do you know it's a metaphor? Now, here's where the confusion comes, and perhaps it will help somebody to think about this. People get very allergic when I say statements like this, Christians. So let me make you nervous just for a minute or two. It's vastly important to understand how literature works. All of literature, all of science is full of metaphor. But the fundamental mistake people who don't think make is this. They think that because a sentence involves a metaphor, it doesn't talk about reality. Jesus said, I am the door. He's not a literal door at the base level of literalism, but he's a real door. I believe it's a real doorway into a genuine experience of God, of forgiveness and eternal life. That's another story, of course. Non-literal doesn't mean non-real. And that's where the confusion comes. Sometimes people sitting with me in a plane, I remember one chap said to me, I'd said I'd been teaching the Bible, and he was rather disparaging. He said, didn't you take it literally? And I said to him, when people like you ask me a question like that, I say, Israel was a land flowing with milk and honey. When the Israelites arrived in Canaan, a great sticky mess of milk and honey came hurtling down the main street. No, I said, of course he thought I was mad at this point. No, I said, you take it spiritually. Israel was a land full of the milk of the Word and the honey of the Holy Spirit. I said, look, let's analyze the sentence. Israel was a land, that's literal, base level. Milk and honey, they were literal. There was good grass, good cows, bees and so on. Flowing is a metaphor. I said, we learned to pick that up. I said, I came flying through the town today in my car. What does that mean? Well, it's non-literal, but it's telling you something real. I was driving too fast. Did you get the idea? If I say to you tonight, my heart is broken, you don't say you need the hospital. But you know I'm talking about a real, painful and deep experience. So my problem often with Christians is that they treat the Bible as less than a book when they should treat it as more than a book. And once you clear that up, it opens avenues of understanding. Now, therefore, I'm prepared to ask myself lots of questions about what I believe. But as I think about your question, have I ever modified? Well, my understanding of science, I would say, has amplified my understanding of the Bible. And of course, knowledge of various facts to do with history has cleared up some of the problems in studying the Bible, ancient history and all of this kind of thing. But I'm trying all the time to think of somewhere where I came to stop and say, look, that's simply wrong. I believe that that's an interpretation of the Bible. I now no longer hold it as valid. I'm sure there are dozens of things like that. But you've caught me out. I just can't think of any.
I caught you speechless.
Sorry?
I caught you speechless, and that's...
oh, something like that, yes.
Very good.
Thoughtless, not speechless.
So we're at the end of this, so let me ask you one final question. So in your discussion, you have certainly made a case that there is a grand designer, which you call God. So how do you get from that explanation to something that's labeled Christianity?
That's a seriously important question because it's utterly valid. You're quite right. My arguments tonight have concentrated on the title of the lecture, which I try to be faithful to. Cosmic Chemistry, Do Science, and God Mix. My argument has been yes. And occasionally through the evening, not often, Christianity has come up. But the question involves reflecting on the fact that there's a vast leap from, say, design in the universe, there's a rationality behind it, to the specifics of Christianity. I'm very aware of that because many of my colleagues are very happy and interested in the God of the scientists and all this kind of thing. There's some sort of overarching intelligence. But then they say, don't talk to me about a personal God. So let me try and answer your question very briefly. There is a very big step. And for it, you need to step outside science. Of course you do. Because Christianity is history and experience specific. It makes claims about the nature of history. It doesn't work in generalized propositions as science does. And science is ill-equipped to deal with it in ways in which I could tease out. So we need different kinds of evidence. Number one, and you've asked about Christianity, so I'll concentrate there. There was a person called Jesus Christ. Ancient historians confirm it. Sometimes, foolishly, people like Richard Dawkins say that the case for the existence of Christ is very weak, but he's withdrawn that. There's virtually no ancient historian I know in the world that would raise the question of Jesus' existence. The claims that he made are stupendous. He claimed to be God incarnate, which logically and obviously is utterly absurd unless it's true. And you see, I grew up where I've seen, at the level of the evidence of experience, that Christianity is testable. Let me put it this way. I see two kinds of evidence for the truth of Christianity. This is loose and philosophically not tight, so don't hold me to it. But roughly speaking, there's objective evidence out there, independent of me. And there's subjective evidence, my own personal experience. Both come together. And out there, I simply observe historically the nature of Christ's claims, the documents about him, their reliability, as historical documents, way beyond anything at a comparable age in the ancient world. The movement that became Christianity, coming out of Judaism, which wasn't a proselytizing religion, claiming to have exploded in the first century at an event which we now call Anastasis, the resurrection of Jesus. I believe we can get at that forensically. Now, science is interesting because we often at school learn science in terms of repeatable experimentation, and some people think that's the whole of science. Well, you'd rule cosmology out if you believed that. A great deal of science is what we might call historical science. Now, the inductive method, that is, repeat this experiment, you get this result, can't deal with unique events in history. There you have to use something not called induction, but abduction, which is the inference to the best explanation. That's what detective novels do all the time. If A happened, then we'd expect B happens. B did happen, so it's plausible that A happened. But if C happened, B would also happen. So C, so we compare A and C, and we make an inference to the best explanation. That's how Miss Marple does her work, and Inspector Morse and Lewis and all the rest of them, of our Oxford detectives. So that forensic examination. I remember sitting in Cambridge, it was a turning point, listening to one of the world's leading law professors. And he said, I want as a lawyer, and he was a professor of Islamic law, interestingly, and a Christian. He said, I want to make a forensic investigation of the resurrection of Jesus. I'd never heard anything like it before. How reliable is it, and so on. The book, for those of you who are interested, is called Gunning for God, the last 2 chapters, dealing with this kind of question. So, to cut a long story short, and this is just an assertion, so please treat it as that, I am intellectually convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. And that has colossal implications, because it leads me first to ask, why did he die? It leads me to go backwards over his claims to be the Son of God, to be the one who dies for my sins. Now, those words may seem to you like mumbo-jumbo coming out of space, but you know, as Pascal said, listen to what people have to say before you attack it, because if you don't, you might be attacking what they don't believe. And it's very important to listen to what the Christian claims are, or any other claims, before you decide for them or against them. So there's that intellectual side. And I've gone over it again and again and again and again from every conceivable point of view. I take the works of atheists enormously seriously. Enormously seriously. And I've done it since I was 13. Spent my whole life doing it. Because I don't want to be fooled. I'm not interested in Christianity being helpful. I'm interested in whether it's true or not. So that's one side. But then there's the testable side. People have often said to me, Christianity isn't testable. Of course it is. Of course it is. Listen, let me just explain one example. Jesus Christ claims that if I'm prepared to repent, which is a nasty word, which means I've messed up, and all of us have messed up, and prepared to confess it to him, then he's prepared to give me as a gift, because he loves me, forgiveness and eternal life and peace. You can test that. I've tested it. I've seen it transform the lives of hundreds of people. I've not seen atheism do that. Perhaps it does. But when you've watched people who are almost at the verge of suicide, and they come to faith in Christ and their life changes completely, you're going to think there's something in this. When you see people who've been hooked on drugs, and there's no escape, and through faith in Christ they're helped to come off that. When you see marriages rescued from ruin, as I've seen dozens of times through faith in Christ, you begin to think there's something in this. It's testable. And it's testable when the chips are down. I'm not often very personal, but it's a personal thing. Experience is a very personal thing. I shouldn't be here. 8 years ago, I was about to die, within milliseconds of death. And the doctors rushed me through a hospital, threw me on an operating table and saved my life. And when they'd done so by inserting a stent in my heart, the professor of surgery said, "Professor Lennox, I don't know what to say to you. You ought to be dead." 40 minutes before, I'd said goodbye to my wife. And I had complete peace. You say it's psychological. Maybe it is. But if Christianity's true, it's exactly what I would have expected. I knew I'd see her again because we share the same faith. And one of the glues of our marriage for 46 years is that we try every day to read and pray and take our lives to God, and we've experienced in our family day after day, week after week, the guidance, the presence, the reality of love and friendship that transcends the human. And, you know, I'm in a world where I'm a human being. I need affection. I need love. And I see a world where people are starving of it, and they've never begun to consider that it can be received. Now, I'm in danger of preaching, so I must stop. But then I'm Irish, and you'll forgive me. Isn't it odd, by the way, how people can get worked up at a football match, and we'll allow that, but get them worked up about God? Oh, you mustn't do that. Let me tell you, as a professor from Oxford, that the biggest thing in my life is that Jesus loves me. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Lennox.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.